we are now official. Saint Death's Daughter. Uh, I'm still trying to figure out what to make of this book. It was not at all what I expected. Um, and incidentally, I was in the audience when you won the World Fantasy for this. Congratulations! That
Thank
was a
you.
major coup. And now that I have read it, I'm like, yeah, I think this rates an award. Um, Impressive bit of world building. Now, I'm just going to make one comment, and then I'm going to let everybody else chime in what they thought of it, and which is that by the end of the book, I was beginning to suspect that this is not actually a fantasy,
Mm.
that this is borderline science fiction. I started getting the lineaments of nanotech strewn throughout this thing, and the consistency of the way it was deployed led me to believe that you were playing a bit of a shell game genre wise. But I could be completely wrong. But that's my thesis, and until it's completely shot down, I'm sticking to it.
I'm not going to shoot it down, but thanks for the idea. There's a whole other book left to write, so I could always bend that way on purpose.
This is not Earth, is it?
It's not Earth.
Which was the first thing I twigged to, and then the second thing was, oh, okay, this is perhaps maybe a colony, and they've kind of drifted pretty far from their origins. And anyway, that's where I went with it at some point.
There's certainly precedent for that in books I have read in my childhood and have been influenced by. But yes, yeah, like it is a long game in that a lot of my stories and novels take place on Eighth, and there's some set in lots of different parts of the timeline. So who knows?
Okay, anybody else? Questions? Comments?
Well, I've said and written everything I meant to write, and Claire, that I loved it. For me, one of my Naomi Kanakia, who wrote a lot of science fiction, and now has gone on to writing mostly YA novels and at least one adult novel, contemporary set. But she, in her Substack, just had a essay called "Style and Story Are the Same Thing." And one of the things she was after was, she's sick and tired of people who say, well, the book doesn't have any plot, but it's nicely written, and vice versa, people who say, I don't want to read all this prose, I just want a plot. And for one thing, Saint Death's Daughter has a heck of a lot of plot. It's not missing that.
And an awful lot of prose.
But the style is the story in this case to a very great extent, I think.
Carlos, my husband, often says character is plot, which I found very reassuring because I'd grown up hearing, don't do info dumps. And then at some point he was like, all fiction is an info dump. It's just, can you carry it off with panache, So, but yeah, like I love that style is story and character is plot. I feel like any sufficiently charming character with sufficiently voluptuous or interesting or weird prose, you follow them through that. I like that sort of thing. I guess it's like, and there is a mood right now about vibes. They're like, only vibes, no plot. And that is a style. I don't think it's like for everyone or for every story, but I think it's an interesting thing that some people are craving right now, both readers and writers.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, okay. I'll jump in. The style over substance argument has been going on since Henry James completely destroyed the division between genre and mainstream, and he contradicted himself a couple of times in that regard.
He was large; he contained multitudes.
Yeah, he is large. He can contain multitudes. I mean, he chewed H.G. Wells out for paying attention to everything except the important thing, which is character, and by that. I mean, H.G. Wells paid attention to landscape, and then later William or Henry James said that uh, landscape is character.
Yeah.
So, okay, you can't have it both ways, and that argument has been going on for quite a while. It is fair to say that when all 8 cylinders are firing at the same time, it all is as important as everything else in it. And in this case, the character and the landscape are seamless.
Thank you.
You can't have these people be who and what they are without that particular landscape. And that landscape makes no sense without those characters moving through it. That's what we all strive for when we're trying to write this stuff, I think. And once in a while, somebody gets it right, and you applaud and you give them an award. Uh, but it does make the analysis on that basis both frustrating and problematic, and ultimately beside the point.
Hmm.
Um, so when now I'll tell you, I read this aloud to my wife. We did this as one of our read alouds this past year, and it does that really rather well. And I think that that's probably the only time when the whole question of style is important. Does it flow when you're reading it aloud? Because there's a lot of books I've read silently that were fine, and then I try to read them aloud. It's like, boy, this is clunky. Because you trip over phrases, the rhythm is all wrong, etc. But in this case, and there's something austerely florid about the prose in this, and I wanted to know if this was a conscious choice or because it's
So I guess austerely florid is a beautiful phrase. And I wish I'd come up with it. I'm an actor by training as well as a writer. So all of my drafts since I was little, I would like run to my mom doing dishes and I'd be like, "Hey, I wrote 2 sentences. You better hear them aloud." So like, and with Carlos and I, every single draft, which and we both draft a lot, is always read aloud to each other. I often still call my mom, read another draft to her. I call my friend in Canada, read a draft to her. She reads to me. So there's a lot of reading aloud involved in all of the revisions, and so it has to sound good aloud. That said, I have worked really hard to practice restraint because something could sound really pretty and mean nothing, and that was a lot of my younger writing. But so the austere is interesting. So I guess is like a lot of the 12 drafts I did was trying to trim it down. What Carlos say about poetry? He was quoting somebody else who said poetry is what will suffice. And so what I hope to do is what will suffice for this work. And that might be very, very florid at times, but it is the least amount of florid I can do as far as what I'm hoping to do. I really admire a very stark prose style. I really like very actiony novels. I read a lot of, I don't know, like that kind of urban fantasy where there's a lot of monster fighting and things are blowing up and there's a lot of plot and they know a lot about guns. I mean, I do, and I read mysteries, which are very plotty, but I read a lot of romance, which is mostly character. So it is interesting, but I do read when I write to read aloud. So I'm glad it does work on that level.
okay. Yeah, Stark wouldn't work for this because there are just too many shades of gray
Mhm.
in the palette, so to speak. Which is why I said austerely florid, because it's austere in that it's like living inside an Addams Family landscape in a lot of ways. I couldn't find any color anywhere until they get to the tavern.
Mm. Okay.
And then suddenly there's this explosion of all this. Wow, it's almost an overload. You meet these other people, and the colors are it's Technicolor, and yet it didn't make me miss the color in the other parts, because your descriptions of it and the details that went into all the lineaments of the house and the history of what was going on and all that sort of substituted for the rainbow,
Mhm.
which is why I say florid, because you could get lost in some of the descriptions here. And yet every one of the descriptions was tied to an action, which I think is the trick. The whole don't do info dumps. This is the way you could do an info dump and like make it sound like it's not an info dump because something is happening as you're explaining all this. You do that almost at every turn. So as you can tell, I'm impressed uh, by the work you did. Now, the
I
real
noticed that too, though. I'll interrupt you, Mark, because I noticed
Okay.
that we would be in like at least the buildup of an action scene, not the epic of it or the pinnacle of it, but we're building up to this. Like you can tell it's going to be action, and there'd be a paragraph of description of the another person or another place that we're in, and I was not annoyed by that. I don't think I would have noticed if I weren't a writer myself.
My mentor on early drafts of early things I used to send him, he'd say, like he'd write me letters. He's like, well, this, the dialogue's really great. The characters are lovable. Then you have these lumps of prose like uncooked dumplings was in an early letter of his. I tried to pay attention to it.
That's interesting. Yeah, but I never felt like I lost track of the action or where we were or who was in the room, so to speak. So I thought that your drafting worked. It really worked well for me.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Is that Jean?
Yeah, that was Jean. I still have the letter.
So this was delightfully gothic.
Oh, thank you.
Reminded me of Gorman Gast and Michael Moorcock and Zelazny's Amber series in a good way. But also like, Bronte sisters and things. I mean, it was very much the landscape, as Mark indicated, was the character, and the house is a character, right? Because the house has the history and the way you blend, because Laney's a necromancer, the way you blend life and death, like the history of dead characters, some of whom are not around, like the parents, but we get to know. I love walking into her dad's room for the first time and getting to know her dad. I really liked him.
Yeah, me too.
Rascal though he is, I liked him a lot, and hated her mom. And they feel like presences, like they're in the book as living people, even though they're dead. that grandpa, is it Raid?
Rad from Irradiant. Yeah, Raid would make sense. I call him Rad because I think it's funny.
I called him Rad until I found out it was short for Irradiant, and then I was like, should it be Raid?
It could be Rad after his middle name, Radithor, which is a 20th century word, but I just had to use it. It was Radithor was the word for when they were irradiating everything because they thought it was good for you. Was the brand name of irradiated water, like drink Radithor, and they would irradiate water and be like, this will make you powerful, healthy, and strong.
It's atomic.
Yes, I gave him just a poisonous name as much as I could.
That's perfect. Yeah, I mean, I like the history of the war and stuff and his involvement in that. How that went for him. The idea of a necromancer dying from his own necromancy is delicious.
One of the central parts of book 2, which I just turned in, which is coming out soon. So yeah, Rad is a POV character in that one. This one is so close to Laney. And then in book 2, I was like, well, let's try opening it up a little bit and not trying to open it up to several POV characters and keep it as Laney's story. But yeah, it was really fun. It was like suddenly going from 1 camera to 4, and then just making sure I'm keeping track and not dizzying the reader too much. Hopefully, we'll see if it works.
No, that'll be fun. I look forward to it. He's got.
Did you know while you were working on this book for the last dozen years or whatever it was, what the general shape of the second and third books would be?
Yes. Now, bear in mind, the titles came like after they were accepted for publication, because the working titles were like Miscellaneous Stones, Necromancer was the first one. And then the next one was going to be Miscellaneous Stones, Psychopomp, or no, Justiciar, and then the third was Psychopomp. So I knew the progress because I'm a big fan of Bujold, and I like how Miles Verkosigan goes from a in utero or a twinkle in his parents' eyes all the way up to post his dad's death. And I really think like I didn't write this. I know she's a YA age, but I didn't write it to be YA as a like I knew she's gonna be older in the second one and even older in the third one. So I had some sense of the beats, I guess, of like these major beats in her life. And I thought that what ended up being the plot of book 2 is actually the plot of book 3. Book 3 is going to be a very court intrigue mystery, but the way it worked out, there were 2 reasons to do it this way, and one was it was a projected trilogy. So not knowing if that third one would come to pass, I had to write the second book 3 ways, as if it was the first book a reader was going to read, because it might be the one they pick up, as if it were the second book in a trilogy, and if it were the last book in a duology. So that was the trick I had to try to pull off. And again, I don't know. I hope so. It was successful in that it felt like a duology, because my editor wrote, he's like, this is a projected trilogy, right? You seem to wrap up a lot of threads. I was like, aha, but I didn't wrap up all of the threads. Here's the third book. And like, once I said what that was, he was like, oh yeah, but I still don't know if I've got it or not, which is the problem with the last book. Was like, I was like, tell my agent, should I start this one yet? Because the last took me 12 years. And he's like, no, just wait for the numbers, see if they want it. And this is like, well, do I start the third one yet? Or it's the time frame is so little, but I don't have to write hundreds of thousands of words for every book. I have to learn to, what's it called? Feature creep. Gotta rein that in a little bit. But yeah, the plots were all there. I just switched the order around, and I'm more pleased with the order as is, because if this was, the first one was like a Bildungsroman, the second one is much more of a picaresque, where they're moving through a landscape, and it's a picaresque, kind of a dark comedy picaresque, like Candide maybe. And then the third one is like the court intrigue mystery, very political. And then so the second one kind of takes care of Grandpa Rad's storyline, and the third one does a lot of overarching stuff, which I think will be really fun too. And that too will be older, which will be very, very fun. As a teenager, I've been wanting to play with her as a teenager.
So, what was the germ? What was the initial impulse to do? And I gather that Lainey was the center of the whole enterprise when you started it, or do I have that wrong?
My friend took me shooting in Arizona. We both grew up in Phoenix, and I was like mid-20s, and she declaimed that if I was going to be a writer, I should probably know things like how to shoot a gun. And I was like, okay. So she took me to the desert to shoot some tires and cacti. And we had earphones on. But I think either mine weren't working or I'm very noise sensitive. I know the latter is true, but I really there was no muffle on that. And after the first time I shot the gun, I had such a reaction. Like my hands started sweating. I was not scared of it until I shot it. And then I didn't want to hear it again. I didn't want to hear the noise. And so I thought it would be really interesting. The initial idea was a person growing up in a family of assassins. Who is allergic to violence. So the necromancy thing happened a little later, which was like the funniest thing, because as you go through in my 20s, a lot of the cons I went to, the conventions, it was just starting to talk about, is your default protagonist white and male? Is your default NPC white and male? Let's change that up. Or like, are you doing a Mary Sue? Like all of these things. And one of the things that I was struggling with in my 20s was how everybody's response to violence is violence. Everybody's response to friendliness is violence. Somebody says hi, you punch them in the face in a fantasy novel. So I was like, it would be a neat trick to try to solve a fantasy novel with a character who can't resort to violence. And it's hard. So that was the other thing. So I was interested in a character who was so unlike the people she grew up with that it was made her physically ill, which I think, and if you know a lot of artists and they grow up in families of like lawyers or doctors or sometimes religious zealots, and they are just like this thing that is alien, very much like Jane Eyre, you mentioned the Brontes, that there's something that's really interesting there. And I really like the idea that that can be a power, that you're so repulsed by violence that it can raise the dead. And what's metaphorically, that's very rich stuff to work with, I think. So shooting a gun, I was bad at it.
It's the book, so it was a worthy experience.
I just
So,
finished watching the first season of Fargo on TV, and there's an awful lot of violence in that. I don't know if anyone else has seen that, but
I just saw the movie. I haven't seen the TV series yet.
Yeah, given the movie it was based on, that sort of.
but the first series, they've done several more series, which I think go farther away. But the first series opens up essentially like it's going to retell the movie, which would make no sense. But you have characters, one of the main characters is very clearly the William Macy character from the movie. And you have a policeman with a pregnant wife instead of a pregnant policeman with a husband, and all this. And it looks like, oh, it's going to be the same thing. And it's kind of similar things are happening. And then it takes a different, rather dark turn fairly quickly. And
is it funny though? Because that was what I loved about Fargo, the movie.
It is considered to be a black comedy. I mean,
oh, good, yeah.
And Billy Bob Thornton is the main villain, and he is very good at that.
I love it. Like the TV series Hannibal was very violent, and I watched that twice through. Although the third season I could take or leave, But I do kind of like an operatic violence where it's almost like watching a cartoon. There's something technically very interesting in that.
Or like John Wick.
I've only seen the third one of those, but
my son made us watch all of them because he loves them, and it's very impressive, but it's also implausible, and like the scenes where they're just shooting, like once in a subway, and they're shooting, both sides are shooting submachine guns all over the place. And there's all these people in the subway cars, and as far as they show us, nobody gets hurt but the people who are actually shooting. It's like,
right.
I don't think so.
Right.
So. Those are definitely superhero fantasies in a way, because
yeah,
I've been in a few fights. No one can take that much punishment in a 24-hour period and even think that they're going to stand up. So that's what I wanted to like Daredevil, and the same thing. He gets kicked around so savagely all the time. No, he should be in the hospital through 2/3 of whatever his adventures are. But
so I'm doing, speaking of violence, I'm doing a reread of Octavia E. Butler's Parable of the Sower in real time, because it's set in the years 2024 to 2027.
Oh, wow.
The chapters sections are based on the particular days. So on the day that it takes place, I'm reading it. And the protagonist of that has a similar affliction to Lainey in that she is empathic. And it's a disability because when she sees people in pain, not just through violence, but in any kind of pain or suffering, she tends to mirror it in her own body. And I really like the idea that there's a kind of a twist of the knife to have necromancers, because, they all have this allergy, this magical allergy, and then they outgrow it if they live long enough, if it doesn't kill them first. And first of all, I like the idea of like having a high mortality rate for necromancers, because that makes sense, right?
Yeah, they're so OP.
So close to death.
Yeah.
Right? They're like walking in its shadow all the time. But then like once they outgrow their allergy, they're able to lead, an army of undead and kill a bunch of people, and it doesn't hurt them. And that's interesting.
So long as it's the undead doing it, I think. It's like that would and yeah. And the more you do it, it's like the further away you get from it being a religious experience, probably.
Sure.
Yeah.
It's interesting because, even like Grandpa Rad, he grew up with that allergy, and he had to, and it must have been very psychologically affecting to him.
I
But he
think, yeah.
became
I
the
think
bastard he was.
he is a bastard, and I think there was like lots of. Also grew up. I think he was born. So he's born with the allergy, but I think he was also born without empathy. I think he was a person with a little quirk of brain chemistry that bent him that way. So once he got over the physical stuff, he had no emotional stuff to fall back on. He was just you know, awry. But Lainey had that. She was able to, and she had a great deal of nurturing from Goody Graves in a much different way than Radiant, who had a lot of siblings who probably bullied him, and he was sort of the runt of the litter. So I think they just grew up under different sets of
Different
pressures. Yeah.
Well, Nita has that too. I mean,
Yeah,
she's
that's what I was gonna say.
narcissistic sociopath.
Yeah.
And with the with the recent election, I've just been reading so much about a narcissistic sociopath, and I'm like, this is my vacation from that. It's a little bit of a bus driver's holiday, but I mean, she's a piece of work, that one, and growing up with that as your older sister, knowing that you can't fight back, right?
I like that it makes Lainey slippery. Like she's pretty good at lying. She doesn't do it a lot. She's good at lying. She's good at wriggling out. She's good at like fawning and distracting. Like she's got a bunch of tools in her arsenal that I think as a grown up she'll have to examine closely, as she goes on, because she's she can be manipulative, but I think, and she can be easily distracted and dreamy because there's other things she'd rather think about than somebody concentrating on violence. So yeah, she's like it gave her a bunch of tools that I do see in the real world too, that were useful to her then, that may not always be useful to her in the future.
Well, the other thing is one of the themes. I mean, I'm talking with the author about themes, right? So I don't know if
you could point things out. Maybe it's things I haven't thought about, which is always
so
very fun to hear.
One of the themes I picked up was consent and lack of consent, right? Both sisters have magical abilities that overrule consent, right? There's the fascination, which makes a living person into a slave, and there's necromancy, which makes a dead person into a slave, right? And the limits of Goody Graves' ability to have free will, is explored in some depth. And you have people whose their family is certainly about a lack of consent. You have an executioner dad, a dad, and an assassin mom, both of which end people's lives without consent. And then you have the daughters who control people without consent. And neither of those girls asked for those talents. But, one of them, it suits her personality. But the other one, Lainey hasn't really examined the consequences of that setup for her ethics, right? Her ethics were formed in this family of of course there's the undead servant. Of course my parents both killed lots of people, right? And even Grandpa Raid, is my main, Wikipedia on magic. He killed thousands of people and ripped the souls out of all these mages and imprisoned them in a sarcophagus and did all it, I mean, there's a whole lot of ethics that she is just not looking at, but it's right there for the reader.
Yeah.
And I thought that was really fascinating as a theme.
There was that moment when she was saying that she tried to only ever ask the Revenant to do stuff for her, and she tried not to command her, and she didn't like it when people commanded her. But then
she doesn't try to free her.
Right. And there was that question of, so when I ask you to do things, you don't have to do them, do you? And it was kind of left like, well, I maybe do. Maybe that still is a command. And I loved that moment happened, even if Lainey didn't let herself dive into that too much. She was like, well, I'm gonna release you anyways. I don't want to deal with that. But I thought that was a really interesting moment. Loved that.
I think the some of the stuff of book 2, not all of it, because she's still it's only a few months later in book 2, but the one of the things she first of all has to like question everything she's ever learned. This is like the beginning of that journey of like everything I learned was kind of wrong with there was some truth that has been totally obscured by like even how she does necromancy, the bloodletting. You actually don't have to do that to do necromancy. You have to share your substance, and blood is the I don't know the stuff that holds substance. But she figures out a way to do it with the flying tiger eggs the first time she does it. But it's something that Grandpa Rat didn't even know. He didn't know how to do that. So in the second book, when she raises the dead, and it's much more fluid and it's much more they know everything about her, she knows everything about them becoming them becoming her. It's like so it's the consent is much more built in because it's not like I bleed on you, you come alive, and by doing this making you undead I actually destroy you completely as well. So it's an interesting thing, and I think it's more and more, especially as she gets older, because she's in her young 20s, and I hope that as she gets older and even beyond the scope of the trilogy in my head, she's just going to learn so many cool things that is so different from and so far away from her child.
Well, it seems to me that one of the things that she relies on is an unexamined assumption of um, free action. That she, being who she is, can figure out a way to get what she wants in any number of ways, some of it dependent upon associations. And that gets completely burned to the ground at the end when the love of her life basically says, no, this isn't the way this works, and you're going to be exiled. Seems to me that that's a moment in which she has to turn around and look at herself and say, all of my assumptions about what I'm able to do are wrong, and I'm no more free than anybody that I make use of.
Yeah,
That was my take on it.
that
Because
and
what
also
I was
I
going to get to have, I can't have because everybody is constrained in this world.
also just she grew up alone in a castle with no family really. So
Yeah.
she assumed, I think, that her first love would work out. I think we all do. And then to see that there's this bigger world and her love has bigger responsibilities than she ever knew existed, I think was heartbreaking, but really worked. I mean, it really worked, and it pushed her into a new story. So that's exciting too. But it was like a big revelation, I think.
That's a stage in almost anyone's growing up, I think, is learning that you can't have everything you want, in essence. It's a stage in 4-year-olds that I know. I have a 4-year-old granddaughter, and it's quite clear that she thinks she can have anything she wants if she yells loud enough or cries loud enough or whatever. And so
Yeah, I think she doesn't, because she's lost so much. She does lose pretty much everything in the book, including at one point her niece, who was like the center of her world for so many years. So I don't think she expected to get everything she wanted, but I think she assumed that this thing that she'd had since childhood, at least, who was like really one of her longest friends and her best friend and her first lover, I think she thought, oh, in all of Stone's history, all of the Stoneses in the Bracken Wilds, they've always been like this. We're more powerful together. We go together. We're part of a political unit. What makes Lyria out of power in the world, and to like realize that Lyria was making different choices, and that everything she'd done, had major consequences because she wasn't living in this world, in this new generation. She was still kind of caught up in former narratives. I think it's good for her, though. I don't, I always wanted Lainey to have lots of lovers and like experience the world in multiple ways. And I think she's going to get that. So that's nice.
does this is connected to many of your other stories, including your actual first novel, right?
It was accidental.
Yeah, your accidental first novel, right? But um, does this trilogy ever explicitly interact with some of the other stories we've already read? That
I mean, there's all kinds of Easter eggs. The Darkbreaker stuff takes place much further up the timeline, like sort of in our early 20th century. So this would be like 400 to 600 years before that. I always think it's about 400, 600 years. So then some of the Bone Swan stuff, I think that this trilogy sort of is a historical predecessor to most of it. But if you read the later stories, some of the gods have traveled, the way religion travels continents or is borrowed from other places. That so far, I think that this is the only set of stories that takes place on this continent. But the Quadib, if you go low enough, kind of shares with Belisar as part of the desert becomes a different desert. So like there are like a lot of Easter eggs that Bone Swans of Amundale, the story itself, has that juniper tree reference, which is also Kaiwit, the captured god. It's the same story. It's the same reference. That god comes from that story. Was a murdered child, was buried beneath a tree, became a bird. People came to pray to hope that the bird would help them with their own murdered children, and then eventually started sacrificing their children to pray to that god, and that god is just so messed up because of that. So like Kaiwit has its origin in the origins of the Bone Swan story as well. Trying to think of what else that's immediately apparent. Kantu, the flying god of thunder, her origin story is in Life on the Sun, also in Bone Swan. So some of the gods have a larger life outside of this little of Quadib and Little Lyriat.
it makes me think a little bit of you've read a lot of Sherwood Smith stuff.
I haven't yet. I've heard of her though.
So Sherwood, ever since she was a teenager, was writing stories in this invented world, and so her stories, they can look like they're completely different, but she'll tell you if you ask, much as you're telling us.
Yeah.
No, actually, this was several hundred years before in a different part of the world, but they're all in the same place. So it's like,
Yeah, I don't think I always write. Carlos says I always write in the same world, and I don't think that's true. But I like making jokes, and so I've not been very terribly organized about it because they were just little jokes. You never know when you're in your early 20s and writing something, and you put a line in for fun, and then a couple years another little line in for fun, and then all of a sudden 20 years later, and you're like, oh shit. It's a world, and that you have to go back and check all your work or justify things. So but it's not organized. I didn't start out to do that. So, but it's still fun, even if I'm not consistent.
so is Martyr's Gem in this world as well?
The bone shark, Agonath, the sea god, is also called the bone shark. So I think I did that to kind of keep that option open. So yeah. So if there are bone sharks in this world, but see, that would be like if it would be the equivalent of our of a Pacific island, and I guess Lyriat would be, well, Quadib is like the equivalent of Arabia. So, and if you put it all together, so it's like that side of the world, Middle East, Eastern Europe, part of that. So like. So it's so far away and in such a different part of the timeline. We have at home, we have these two what are they, like histographs, like lists of, there's a list across and a list down. It's like the timeline and then what's happening in each country. And it's so fascinating to be like, oh, that was happening when that was happening in China, that was happening in Egypt. It's a mind bender. So
Have you drawn up something like that for your world? And do you have
not yet. I think I'd do it if enough people expressed interest, but then they'd have to know that I was doing it at all. I'd probably blog about it. I think I've made, at some point, I thought I made I made a lore book for a friend who was he'd been setting his D&D games in my world, and I didn't know that. And so he's like, you want to put something together to help? And he said, okay. So.
Okay. There was another question that I had, and it'll come to me in about an hour. Um, the whole Oh yeah, that's with the mention of the gods and all that, which brought to mind because to me it felt somewhat similar to Zelazny's Lord of Light, which
Mm.
was the reason why I was kind of twigging on the possibility that really underlying all of this fantasy stuff is a little bit of science fiction. That the gods are because they're very removed. You have to really draw them in, and then they end up giving you something fairly specific even if the people asking for favors don't know what it is they're asking for.
Hmm.
There are always double-edged swords. In, is this something of a warning? Be careful what you ask for from a god. You might get it.
Huh. My thing with gods, one of the things is that if I think of our world and all of the religions in it, not just current but past, there's and then if you if you take it that gods aren't real unless you believe in them, and the more you believe in them, the more real they are, and if you really, really believe in them, you get power. It's sort of like the ultimate placebo effect. I guess that's kind of how I treat gods, is like really powerful placebo effects. And then in like the Darkbreaker stuff, especially the one I'm working on now, which kind of takes place in the equivalent of our 1980s, there's lots of science and there's like space exploration, but also there's goblins and and gentry and like a three world weird system. And that when they start talking about gods and devils and demons or aliens, it's kind of like, how different are all of these things from each other? And particle or wave, right? Like this thing that we call a god, if we just talk about it differently, talk about it like a demon, that's the thing that's going to start manifesting. So like in this world, there are seven heavens or there's seven hells. They're just like a layer away. That's where the gods dwell, or do the demons dwell there? But like it's like the entities are multi-faith depending on the person thinking about them. And I play with that a little bit in book 2 with you've got Grandpa Rad's Saint Death, which he manifests at one point, and you've got Lainey's Saint Death, and they're both Saint Death, but they're like two different entities. So those are some things I think about, but I'm not sure I've got it all figured out. I feel like what I explore the questions through the characters, and I kind of tend to find out what they find out, but they don't necessarily know what it all means. And I know a little bit more than they do, but I'm interested in like, even if they're one thing to one person, if it's a system that's based on belief, then that is malleable.
So it sounds like you're, on one level, you're naturally a discovery writer. You're finding the world as you write it, yet you had to outline a trilogy in order to sell it. So how does that work?
Oh, it's really interesting. Because it is interesting. I do outline, and then the outline deliquesces as I write. But the thing is, I write several million drafts. So, and I occasionally outline, like by the last draft, I'm outlining 3 bullet points at the beginning of a chapter. Like in this chapter, I know I have to accomplish these three things. And especially if I have to suck 3 chapters into one, what are the 3 most important beats that I can take all of these actions and conversations and emotions that have to happen, and I have to make them happen. These 3 things happen. So what can I rewrite it to do? So it's more like that. But with, again, like it's more about beats, right? Like I know that Lainey at one point needs to confront Grandpa Rad, and I know that Lainey at one point needs to reconfront the Blackbird Bride and Lear and try to like win safety for Datu's future through bargaining with people she would rather never see again. Like I know, and also it's like, what's the most interesting thing? Like what's going to cause the most conflict or be the most meaty? So I can, and one of the problems with outlining versus how I write is I'll outline a whole thing. I had huge ambitions for book 2. I had, and I sent the outline in first I sent my agent an outline. It was like 10,000 words because in my head, I was like outlining all the chapters, right? And he's like, can you just, we can't send this to the editor. I was like, can it be like 2 paragraphs or less? And I was like, oh, that kind of, you mean a summary. You know, in my head, an outline is one thing and a summary is another. So like I summarized it. But even then I was summarizing 10,000 words into 2 paragraphs. And I didn't really think about, oh, and that was before I got the little note back from my agent saying, so the publisher is asking how long this one will be. So that's a hint. That it's probably shouldn't be as long as the first one. And I was like, oh, well, just say 100,000 words. Surely I can do that. Absolutely. You know, like but I don't think I can get everything that was in my outline at that point. So I was like, I should take this section out. But by that point, they'd already kind of published the summary to Tor.com about book 2. So this whole thing in my summary about forthcoming, that is just not true anymore because I hadn't written the book yet. So that's all it's embarrassing, but I don't actually think most people will notice or remember from a year or 2 ago. And I think I was more self-conscious about it. I was like, don't do that. So now I kind of, because again, I've written a lot of novellas and short stories, but as far as writing novels on purpose, I'm still at the beginning of my career. And so a lot of it, that's a learning curve. But I think basically knowing your beats and just understanding here's 3 story beats, but on a sentence level, things are so mutable. Like it's like Quicksilver, but I know that this and this and this just need to happen. But how am I going to do it? I don't know. That is infinite. Like that's like a book is infinite in that way, which is it becomes clearer the more drafts I do. And for the first one, by the 12th draft, it was amazing. I was like, I can't believe I just discovered that now. I can't believe it. Could I have just kept writing that book forever and still being delighted and surprised? But maybe, but I was pretty tired by the end. And writing the second book, I managed to do it in 3 drafts, but I felt hurried and felt like probably if I had one more year, I could have gotten it so good, but I didn't. So it has to be what it is. And then the next one will probably be similar. But at least with the second book, I had a strong understanding of character, voice, language, and landscape, which I didn't have to make up wholesale, which would like, at least there was that. So I had to figure out all the other things. With every book, you have to just learn everything, or at least I do. I think some people can just write, but man, I have to research everything. I have to research jellyfish to write a paragraph about, you know, shapeshifters who shapeshift into jellyfish. But that's an awful lot of articles about jellyfish just to be able to have some language to write about them.
Yeah. I've never met a writer that could just write and never look something up. Sometimes they don't notice that they're doing research. I mean, I've gotten into that mode from time to time where I just happen to be writing along, and what is that? And I just do a quick. I don't count it as research, but in fact, it is. You have to go check this damn thing.
Yeah.
So speaking about the book changing, I remember books. There's a Jack Vance book in particular that the jacket copy did not match what the final book was. Some names had changed. A thing that happened at a different time in the book.
So weird.
It's funny because if you guys remember Harriet Klausner, the reviewer for Amazon who reviewed so many books.
I don't. Yeah.
She reviewed that book and she just summarized the plot based on the jacket. It was because the jacket copy was all wrong. She had outed herself without knowing it. Something that many of us had suspected she was doing all along was writing reviews based on jacket copy and maybe looking at the last few pages of the book or something like that. And so that's
what did that give her? Like
prestige. She got written up in all kinds of places as look at this, the most prolific reviewer on Amazon and all that kind of stuff.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
Was
anything
on a cloud.
Got something for her.
Yeah.
And once everybody knew, she sort of took a nosedive, and I forgot completely about her until you just brought her up.
She did die fairly young. I mean, it was, not something you wish on someone, even if she was an ethical reviewer. It was an illness of some kind.
Aw.
But by fairly young, I mean younger than I am now, which counts as pretty young now.
It's young. You must live forever, Rich. All of us must. I insist.
I'm working on it. So you like your editor? Because depending on your writing style, the most important thing is to get an editor that's willing to go to work with you.
Well, so the first one was shopped around, and I just don't think it was very desired by American editors. But there was a woman at Solaris in the UK named Kate Coe, and when she accepted, it was like the acceptance letter of your dreams. It was like all caps, like, I love this. I cannot wait to work with this. We're already making my skeletons. Please work with me. So she was really ideal. But and I got a really good edit letter, and she took me through the process. But midway through 2020, after I turned in my first major revision, it was like to the copy edits at this point. She left Solaris to take care of some health issues. And, like all of us were having mental health issues in 2020. So I lost my editor who loved me and who was the one who like pulled me out of the slush. In that process. And the guy who is my editor now, I was worried because he hadn't like chosen me. He is a kind of higher level editor. She'd chosen him to be my copy editor because he loves words. Like he's a word nerd. He loves etymology, the kind of the way I do. So she thought he'd be able to really appreciate it on a deep level. So we had worked together, but he was very, very polite, very courteous, and also extremely busy because he's a higher level editor. So he was my editor on book 2, and very warm but brief, and so like there's a great deal of uncertainty around it, but he's only ever been kind to me. And I do enjoy working with him. But it was a lot faster process, and it was a lot more uncertain for me, and not even being able to start because there was very little communication until I got an email. I was like, so is the second one done yet? When I hadn't heard from him since the publishing of book 1, and I wasn't done yet because it wasn't even started yet. And that was gave me a kick at the pants as far as like asserting my rights. And if I get worried and antsy, I communicated with my agent, and he was like, don't worry about it until the numbers come in and they talk to you. So I was like, okay, then I won't. But I think I should have, when I was worried, written to them and pushed a little, so yeah, no, I've only had good editorial experiences, but it's obvious to me that what the editor would want for me and with me is different than what the publisher wants for Solaris overall. And I think maybe I did manage to write after turning in 180,000 word first draft, getting it down to 120,000, which is what the publisher wanted. So I did end up, my cut file is a whole other novel, and that is great. But it was such a fast process, and I learned a lot doing it. I'm better at it now, and I'm hoping I'll be even better next time, if there is next time, because though it's a projected trilogy, I still don't have a green light for it. So yeah, but I have no doubts that my editor is at least appreciative of my prose. But I don't know him. I've never even met him on a Zoom or anything. So that's where we're at now. But I did have a kind of a glorious, very responsive editor at the beginning, and now I have a very like a wonderful and attentive editor for when my stuff is in front of him.
So do those cut files, and I always ask this of novelists, because as Mark knows, my position as a short story reviewer for so long, I don't want novelists to stop writing short stories that are so good. Do those cut files have germs of short stories in them?
I would say, does a novella count? Because there is a section, a very like 20,000 word section that I cut, that it was a good cut because it was a whole set piece in and of itself, and I yanked it. And what I ended up doing is, instead of having it take place right then in the book between Lainey and Duantry, who are traveling together, I had it that Duantry and Tanelin, her juror lady, had traveled together in the early time of their first bonding to this place, and a terrible thing had happened. And so Duantry is able to convey some information quickly to Lainey about the time that she went there earlier on in her life. So we learn more about Duantry as a character. We learn about this place they're about to go into, and some of the magic system that is totally different than anything Lainey knows. And instead of having a whole wonderful 20,000 word part of the middle of the book where we could have done that, we just get it quickly in a chapter. and move on. And it works really well. I was glad for that cut. But now I have this piece that has all the beats of a really cool scene and a lot of magic and introduction. But what I'd like to do is I have working title is Rare Morsels. I'd like to rewrite it as the time when Duantry and Tanelin travel. It'd be fun to explore them as younger people, like newly bonded, getting to know each other, and I'll get to like be in this new place, this weird place for a little while. You'll recognize the place, maybe Rich, because it's been a long time since you read Stone Shoes and Jack of the Hills, but it's that place. It's where the Skin Changers live, and the Witch Queen is somebody that you may have met back in Jack of the Hills days in my early 20s, first publication. It's a little homage. It's one of my little jokes.
Very good. So one other thing that made me think of this, that I thought of more with the Dark Breakers, was when I was reading Martha Wells' most recent novel, the Witch King one. She has this thing where there's people in the lower level who come up to the higher levels and maybe lower and higher. Even though that's the words people use, maybe that's not really a fair way to describe it.
Yeah.
It sounds a lot like some of the Dark Breakers setup.
Yeah, it's more like dimensions than levels, but there's only so much language people have at the time. Yeah. I'm more than halfway through Witch King. I was reading that one out loud with my husband, but because of the time switches, so we'd read it aloud in bed, but if we skip 2 or 3 nights, we're like, wait, who are these people? Which timeline are we in? So we've decided that we're going to read it separately on the page, because in that sense, it's easier to track. If we were doing it consistently, like reading every night, but it's more like, hey, do we feel like reading aloud tonight? So instead, I'm reading him The Once and Future Witches by Alex Harrow, which is quite fun and really reads aloud beautifully.
And you're still doing your audiobook readings too, right?
Yeah, the work dried up some over the pandemic. I have a couple books booked later on this year, like in March and April, which is really nice. I find it very reassuring. It's mostly series that I've done before, like, as they continue. And then I think they have plans for me to narrate the second Saint Death book as well. And then I have some private plans about saving a little money and just doing audiobooks of Dark Breakers and the Twice Drowned Saint, because I want them in the world. Total vanity project, but also, I guess, a legacy project. I guess legacy might be a nicer word than vanity, but, isn't it cool to hear poets from the early 20th century read their own work? And I think sometimes, like, all right, I don't know, maybe we'll all be drowning in the digital age and it won't matter in 100 years, but I like the idea of ghosts in the ear, So I'm hoping to save some money and book that for myself. Well, I've got the nice people. The audio company, the media company, Tantor Media, was in Old Saybrook, and I used to take the train there, stay a few nights. I lived a lot closer when I was in Rhode Island, but now I'm in New York. And then during the pandemic, they started sending me. They have an affiliate little, like a family-owned studio, and they are just 3 miles away from me, so I could either walk or take the train. And it's like they have a 3-bedroom apartment. 2 of the bedrooms are converted to studios. They have a little dog, and they've been married for years, and they've become my friends. So I could just rent that space for myself, and they know how to do all the production, and it's very comforting to know that that's my option now, and I'm excited to work with them for that.
Very cool. Very cool. That way, it's nice to do your own audio recordings, because then you get to make the definitive determinations to the pronunciation of all the strange words.
I don't exactly view it like that, because I strongly believe that the reader is a collaborator, and they get to, with words that don't really exist in this world, decide. And, I also think as an actor, how many hundreds of thousands of people have played Hamlet? Many different Hamlets, or Spider-Man. There's lots of different Spider-Men too. And I think it's a pity that audiobooks are so expensive that there usually is only one definitive one. But for the older stuff in the public domain, like Jane Austen and the Brontes, you can hear multiple interpretations of a lot of those. And wonderful to have that choice. So I guess that's what I hope for the future, is that maybe they don't take my version as the definitive version. It's one of many interpretations. Because I have to argue with a lot of people. It's like, oh, wouldn't it be cool? One of my favorite audiobook narrators, Kate Redding. Wouldn't it be cool if Kate Redding read my book? And I got so many like, no, you have to read it, like at me. And I was like, but don't you understand? Wouldn't it be cool if Kate Redding interpreted it at her high level of, I think of myself as like a B movie actor or a daytime television. I don't know what the reality is. That's the reality in my mind, is that that's my level. And then Kate Redding is like Oscar worthy. Do you know what I mean? And wouldn't it be cool to have an Oscar worthy actress do it? But then I get argued down and told to be quiet and narrate my own books because it's better that way.
Yeah, what do you? Yeah, it's you're just the author. What do you know?
What do I know?
Well, I thought I would call you an A-level reader. So I think the one reader I liked the best was the reader of Piranesi, which was Chuedi, and I can't pronounce his name, but I think he is literally an Oscar-level actor. So, but Chuedi, I can't even remember exactly how.
I have that audiobook. I haven't listened to it because we read that one aloud, and that was an incredible read aloud, even for people who didn't know how to pronounce everything. What a book! Oh,
well, anytime you read a book by, at least in my experience, by an English reader, you learn that we Americans, especially me, because I'm probably terrible at pronouncing a lot of words, I learned how to pronounce by reading them and not by hearing them. But we Americans pronounce a lot of things wrong, at least as far as the English are concerned.
I would say we pronounce things differently, or our dialect is different. And when I have to go by, because I've listened to a lot of British narrators, I tend to do British pronunciations as an American, and then I get corrected. I get docked. Well, that's by get edited. I'm like, oh, it's not scone, my dear. It's scone in America. Yeah, I find it fascinating, and then I'm like, wait, I thought it was dour. It's dour. But in fact, both are right. But as an American narrator, the rule is to do the first pronunciation in Merriam-Webster. So there might be 3 right ways to do it, but we have to do the first one.
What was it? About multiple. It is interesting that I read a lot of Trollope and listen to him in audiobooks, and his books, there's sometimes 4 or 5 different narrators, and they're out there available sometimes for free. It's like, I don't know how they pay for that, but it's nice to have that option.
Well, sometimes with stuff like Trollope's in public domain at this point, right? It's young narrators or narrators or actors who've been acting a long time but are trying to break into narration. They'll do this stuff because they have their own studio. They'll record it. Because the more books they have, it's sort of almost like audition tapes. They'll find them. They love the work and they want to interpret it very much like, I've always wanted to play Hamlet. Nothing's stopping me. So there's a little bit of that happening too.
Mm-hmm. I guess that makes sense.
Well, anybody have some final thoughts on this? I gather you get the impression that we had a good time with this book.
I love this book. I really did.
Thank you so much. I mean, I know I'm so grateful you read it. It's so hard to recommend one's own work. It's such a chunky little devil. It's just like, well, if you're into that necromancy, sort of think Adam's Family meets Terry Pratchett, maybe, but that's like, it's hard to do the elevator pitch and believe in it because I'm not at a distance from the book. So I really love when it is somebody's thing because it's what I wanted,
To an extent, it's the Addams Family meets the Byzantine court. I mean, it's just the court intrigue in this. I couldn't quite pin it down what you might have based it on. It's certainly not the British court. Might be French, but I kept thinking it's one of the minor states, either Tuscany the Byzantine court is complicated enough to sustain some of this.
You mean Byzantine enough?
It's.
I love Dorothy Dennett. I love the Lyman of Crawford series, and it probably probably that and every other thing I've read. Again, Bujold has a lot of really cool political intrigue that takes place across multiple worlds, and I just am a huge fan. So I don't know, and she probably based it on all kinds of historical courts. So there's just I've read so much, not nearly enough, and then all of history, and what I try to do is not be too British about it, because I know that's the most major part of my influence. It's the closest to us. And I have to actively work against not doing that, because it's like the default protagonist. There's a default British sensibility that a lot of us fantasy writers do. And it's part of colonialism. It's part of all of that. You have to work really hard to bend away from it, or to have an original thought, to recognize what's not an original thought, to recognize, I think, what Kat Valenti called, I mean, I don't know if she got it from somewhere else, but she called it received language, to make a different choice. That's what drafting is good for. You can, once it's out there, you can recognize it and then be like, all right, let's take it in a different direction.
Yeah. I love Done It is so spectacular. A few years ago, there's a rumor that the Poldark people who did the Poldark miniseries were going to do the Lyman books.
Why would they tease us?
Nothing has happened, so maybe it died in a morning or something, but that would be fantastic. I haven't read Dorothy Dunnett's Lyman novels. They're just amazing. Historical.
I was working at a bookstore, and it was one of those things where a customer came up and just was chatty, and then asked me in such a tone of voice that if I've read the Lyman of Crawford series. And I was like, no, but it was that instantly recognizable tone of voice that, you don't get very often, was like utter fanatic, but for your own good. And like, you must read this. And at that point I was like, I obey. And I read the first 3, and then I had to stop because I think I was too young. Well, I was too young for a lot of things, but I couldn't bear the amount of torture she put Lyman through on all the levels you can. She put that character through the ringer. And then I tried again a few years later, and I think I read them all like in a couple weeks. And I remember I was like, had stayed up through the night, and I'd been reading so much, my eyeball was twitching, and it was dawn, and I was finished with it, and I burst into tears. And I was like, I think I just had a religious experience. It's the closest I've ever gotten to levitating. But I've not read it since then. I own them. I've lent them out, and I've always wanted to go back to them. But will it measure up? I think it will, and that will be as brutal as anything.
Yeah.
Lovely Byzantine stuff in that, by the way.
And there's a lot of stuff in her prequel series that she did.
Niccolo,
yeah, who is turns out you find out he's like Lyman's grandfather or something like that.
Oh, I only did the first few of the Niccolo, and I was like,
they're
not
not
good.
as
Not really
not
interesting.
quite as good.
Yeah.
They're super intricate, and even more intricate than the Lyman books, I think. But the overall narrative doesn't have the drive, I guess, or something that Lyman had.
Yeah.
But she also wrote a book, which I have not yet read, which she retold the story of Macbeth.
I have heard about that one, and I think I may have attempted it, but again bounced because it wasn't Lyman. And at that point, when you've just had a religious experience in one religion, it's like really hard to go to another church and be like, what do you got for me?
Yeah, like I said, I have not read that either. I have a copy because I bought it, but it just
Is it King Hereafter? Is that what she called it?
Yeah, King Hereafter.
Okay.
I think she, as a Scotswoman, wanted to, I believe, sort of reclaim Macbeth from that nasty British guy, Bill Shakespeare.
Yeah.
It's getting on toward 8:30 Central. So any last comments? Any last questions anybody wants?
I look forward to a hoped for musical adaptation of the book. That would be great.
How fun. Somebody said it would make a good Jim Henson movie too, and I was like, "Ooh, puppets! Wouldn't that be cool with the birds and the skeletons? Like, wouldn't that be a cool set of Muppeting to do?"
I'm
The
just
gods.
thinking of
Laney would be the one human in that.
Yeah.
Statler and Waldorf commenting on it would be.
That'd be awesome.
Yeah, they'd be some kind of, necromantically kept alive
Yeah,
in the
for sure.
solarium or something. And Miss Piggy as Nita. Anyway,
Lyra is Kermit the Frog.
Oh, hey,
Well, thank you so much for having me.
thank you very, very
In
much.
Boston
Thank you.
for Bosco.
For BosCon, yes, but not for ReaderCon. So are you going to be at BosCon?
Yeah,
Oh, yes, we'll see you then.
see you then, but no ReaderCon. Okay, I have to be at ReaderCon whenever we figure out who the next Cord Winner Smith Award winner is going to be, which we have no idea.
Well, much appreciation. Again, really enjoyed the book, and thank you for giving us your time.
My pleasure.
It'll be
good luck with volume 2. That comes out in April, I see.
Yeah.
So I'm glad we read it when we did, so we don't have a long wait.
Oh, yeah. And the next one is much shorter, but I hope it will have a weird good time for you all.
We like weird here.
oh, yeah, you may not have been able to tell, but yeah.
I like you all. I think that you have very rich minds, and you probably read so widely and have such vivacious discussions.
Boy, we've got her fooled, right?
Rich has a rich mind.
Rich has a rich mind.
Like I always say, they gave me a choice at birth. I could either be rich or be named rich, and I guess I chose wrong.
Well,
Okay.
thank you.
Could I
So
You like Richie Rich and do both?
ask the regular members to hang around after our
Take
guest.
care.
departs?
Thank you. Bye-bye.
See you, Claire.
Thank you.
See you. Thank you.
Okay,
We need to kill the recording.
kill the recording.
Working on it.